All right, so we'll say good morning, good chodesh. Shkoyach Dovi Ziffer for the Chazara Seder, absolutely beautiful. Baruch Hashem, Shkoyach Zevi for initiating, perpetuating, and it's beautiful to see additional Chavra participating. Really beautiful. I will say so. Good morning, good chodesh. Schos Baruch Hashem to be here. It's so rainy and dark outside. It's so beautiful and light and exciting in here. Baruch Hashem, beginning by thanking all of our sponsors to thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pehei, the Tilsim Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Shemar and Drushos this year as a zechus for Besoros Tavos for Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Haba Alinu Latova, Steve and Terry Zin, in loving memory of Steve's mother, Doris Zin, Devora Bas Rabbi Yisrael Yoel, Zichron Levrach, on the occasion of our 5th yard site. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, Gabi and Shana Cohn, in commemoration of the yard site of Gabi's grandfather, Meir Oxman, Meir Ben Mordechai. Meir Ben Mordechai, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Meretz Hashem, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families, Eino Chama, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Meretz Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. Chol Maaseh Yideihem. Mr. Oxman, just so some of you, most of you probably don't know, but Mr. Oxman was a pillar of this kehila, a mamish pillar of this kehila, someone who was very, very special, not just to the Kohen and Oxman Mishpachas, but Baruch Hashem to our entire shul. Halavai, everything we do here, Shemeres Hashem, be a source of nachas and aliyah for his neshama, and really for the neshamas of all of those who toiled so hard to create this kehila, to both begashmias or beruchnias. Shemeres Hashem, Halavai, should have nachas from everything we accomplish here day in and day out. I will say with that, let us begin. A lot to do today, some really great Gemara ahead of us. Today's daf is Chav Zayin 27. We are picking up on Chavav Amud Beis 26b, at the period, or at least it's a period in my Gemara. It's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, about 11, 12 lines down from the top. Bamini Ravina Merava. So Ravina asked the following shayla from Rava. Nishpa al kikar, listen to this. I swear, I make a shvuah, I swear I am not going to eat a loaf of bread. Umistakin aleha. And what ends up happening? Mistakin aleha means, and now like literal sakana. I need to eat it. I'm in sakana, I have to eat it. So what's the halacha? Mahu. So the Gemara says, sakana, mistakin lishre mar. What are you talking about? If there's sakana bosai, remember again, sakana makes it sound like what? It's pikuach nefesh. If it's pikuach nefesh, then there's nothing to talk about. Then obviously, again, halacha l'maisa, you have to go ahead and eat the loaf. What's the shayla? Ela mitzta'er sva'achla b'shigagas shvuah. Rather, I will say, what's the case over here? The case is not a case of sakana, of danger. Rather, it's a case of mitzta'er. Mitzta'er means what? Mitzta'er means discomfort. Discomfort. Now, what does that mean, discomfort? Rashi says mitzta'er, birav. I'm hungry. Now, again, not like, okay, like I'm hungry, I'm going to die, right? In other words, that again, I'm just really hungry. I'm fine. I'm going to live. Everything is all right. But I happen to be very hungry. Now, Rashi points out something very interesting here. It says, "V'i nami lo ne'amal min shvuah haya okla v'achla." Now, both say the case over here of mistayer is I'm really hungry, and even though I'm fully aware that I made a shvuah, I'm still going to eat a loaf of bread. Now, it happens to be what occurred. I then forgot about the shvuah. So the progression of events is like this. Step 1. I swore I'm not going to, I'm not going to eat a loaf of bread. Okay, then what happens? Mitzta'er, I'm very hungry. And again, in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I'm really hungry. I'm going to eat a loaf of bread. I know I made a shvuah not to. I'm still going to eat the loaf of bread. Then what happens? Before I eat it, I actually forgot about the shvuah and then consumed it. So at the time I ate the loaf of bread, I actually forgot about the shvuah. But the truth is, even had I not forgotten about it, I still would have eaten the loaf. So what's the halacha in such a situation like that? Such an interesting case. Amrale, Tanina, so you learn this in the Mishnah, Shav mi'ediyaso maybe carbon al shigagaso. Lo shav mi'ediyaso, ein maybe carbon al shigagaso. So here's the litmus test. The litmus test says in general is, if you have a lapse of awareness, if somebody would have reminded you about your lapse, if you would have abstained or refrained from the act, that's where you bring a carbon. But if after having been reminded about your lapse, you still would have done the act, then ultimately that falls a little bit more into the category of mazid, and therefore there's no carbon. So I will say, interestingly enough, in this case, halacha l'maisa, because even had I remembered my shvuah, I would have still eaten the loaf. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, it's not called shogeg, and therefore no carbon oleviore. Now again, the pashtos, it would probably not rise to the level of mazid to go ahead and get malchus, right? That far we can't go. But l'maisa can't be called shogeg. It can't be called shogeg if it's clear that my intentions would have been to eat the loaf regardless of the shvuah. Fascinating case. Therefore, we'll say, so just kind of two takeaways over here. Obviously, the obvious one is, if a person made a shvuah not to eat the loaf of bread, and there's sakanas nefashos, right? So remember again, nothing stands in the way of sakanas nefashos, mortal danger, except immorality, idolatry, and murder. Obviously, a shvuah is not going to stand in the way of you going ahead and saving your life. If, however, again, I made a shvuah, but I'm really hungry. So the fascinating thing over here is you see how much intentionality plays a role in our lives. So because over here, I'm so hungry, and I made up in my mind, I'm going to eat the loaf regardless. I'm going to eat regardless. It happens to be now, before I ate the loaf, I actually forgot about the shvuah. That can't be called shogeg. That can't be right. That can't be called Helam Shvuah. Because why? Because again, at a certain point, I expressed that intentionality that I was ready to eat the loaf regardless. Fascinating. Okay, let's go back to Rabbi Shmuel. Interesting case over here. Gamar belibo tzarich shiotze b'svasav. We'll say when a person is making a shvuah, even if I had complete intention is not enough. There must be articulation. So, for example, if I had it in my mind, I know I'm not eating this loaf of bread. And I in my mind, I'm fully committed that I am swearing not to eat that loaf. But I never actually verbally articulated it. It is not a binding shvuah. Shneimar levate b'svasayim. The pasuk says that what's a shvuah? A shvuah is a verbal articulation. So Mar says, Meisei, is a kasha on this. So the Mar says, Meisei, bisvasayim v'lo gamar b'libo minayin. How do I know that halacha l'maisa, if I articulated a shvuah, but did not really have internal intent, that ultimately, again, that it's not a shvuah? How do I know that works? Tamalomar, l'chol asher yivata adam b'shvuah. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says, it says the positive, anything you articulate, which makes it sound like over here that actually we care very little about what you think and care very much about what you articulate. So when it says Haguf Akasha, second white line, Haguf Akasha, here's the inherent contradiction. Amrit bisvasayim v'lo b'leiv. On one hand, you said that Allah Lamaisa, if I articulate a shvuah, I articulate it, but there's no level of cognition, right? That's still a good shvuah. V'hadar amar gamar belibo minayin. And then we asked, how do we know even if you have intent? It sounds like even if you have intent without articulation, that should create a binding shvuah. Amar Rav Sheshes halokasha. Rav Sheshes says it's not a contradiction. Why not? This is what it means to say. It's actually quite interesting. Bisvasayim v'lo shgamar b'libo v'hotzi bisvasav v'lo hotzi. So it says, listen to this. Ultimately, again, bisvasayim teaches me that what? It's not enough to go ahead and have intention and not articulate it. In other words, in order for a shvuah to be binding, there must be a verbal articulation. Gamar b'libo stam minayin. How do we know that if there was intention but never articulation, that doesn't work? Tamalomar l'chol asher yivata. The pasuk says you have to articulate. That's the articulation. El Shmuel kasha. But according to Shmuel, it's problematic. Why the Gemara says Amrav Sheshes taritz ve'imahaki. Here's how you have to say it. Bisvasayim v'lo. So we'll say, what does it mean that you have to articulate it? So here's really the halachic definition of articulation. Bisvasayim v'lo shagamar belibo lahotzi paschitin v'hotzi pas seorin. So we'll say, so listen to this. What does it mean? In order for a shvuah to be binding, not only do you have to articulate, but you have to articulate that which you had intention for. For example, let's say in my mind, I had in my intention was to say, Shvuah shelo ochal pas seorin. Paschitin. I swear I'm not going to eat wheat bread. But when I said the shvuah, what did I say? Shvuah shelo ochal pas seorin. I articulated it as, I swear, I'm not going to eat barley bread. So again, I had intention for wheat bread, but I articulated barley bread. How do I know? Or gamar belibo lahotzi paschitin v'hotzi. All right, sorry. So we'll say halacha l'maisa. That shvuah will not be valid, will not be binding. Why? Because the articulation has to match the intention. Articulation has to match intention. And if there is a disconnect between articulation and intention, the Shevuah does not work. So I'll say, so there's a number of different parts over it. So part one is I need intention, right? But part two is intention by itself is not enough. There's got to be articulation. So part one, intention. Part two, articulation. Part three, the articulation has to match the intention. And if that's not there, then ultimately the Shevuah is not good. Gamra baliba lahotzi pas chitin, vahotzi pas stam minayin. What about the following case? Let's say in my mind, my intention was to say, I take a Shevuah not to eat pas chitin. But it turns out that when I said it, I just said pas. How do I know that that is a good Shevuah? Because remember again, why is that a good Shevuah? Because the truth is, the problematic case is where my articulation does not go ahead and match my intention. But essentially, if I wanted to say pas sorin, but I say pas, although it's not perfect, it works. It works. How do I know? The Gemara says, "Minayin tamalomar l'chol asher yivateh ha'adam." Ultimately, whatever a person will articulate. Good. So I'll say, "Semeisvei." The Gemara says, "So Gemara is the kasha motza sa'secha tishmar v'asisa." So the pasuk says, whatever you articulate, right? Whatever promises or commitments you make, you must go ahead and keep them. Ainli elashotzi b'svasav. I only know that a promise, right, an obligation, whether it's a shvuah or a neder, is binding if I articulate it. Gamra beliba minayin. How do I know that even if I just had intention, that intentionality creates a binding commitment? Tamalomar kol nidiv leiv. Therefore, the pasuk says, anyone who is generous of the heart. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That even intention, in this case, by the way, it's intention of a neder for tzedakah, which is actually very interesting. Even an intention to give creates a binding obligation. That contradicts what we just said before. Now, granted, I will say, I want to point out it's two different cases. We've switched over here to neder. Beforehand, we were talking about shvuah, but still, nevertheless, conceptually, they should really be the same. To which the Gemara says, "Shining hasam d'chsiv kol nediv leiv." It's different over there because, again, by tzedakah, right, in this case, again, that's by the Mishkan. By the Mishkan, it says, kol nediv leiv, any person who has generosity of the heart. So what do you see from here? What you see from there is that halacha l'maisa intentionality is enough, even if it doesn't have articulation. The Gemara says, so why don't you learn from this? Why don't you make, in this case, tzedakah, a vow to give tzedakah? Why don't you make that the paradigmatic example that intentionality works even without articulation? To which the Gemara says, Mishum, David Truma v'kachim, Shnei Ksuvin Abayin Ke'echad. So because Truma, now again, I want to point out, in this case, Rashi points out, Truma means Trumas Melechas HaMishkan. It actually means, again, the donations to the Mishkan. Right? So, tzedakah, the neder to give to the Mishkan, the Torah expresses it as kol nediv leiv. Furthermore, Kadshim, Karbanos also uses that lashon of kol nidiv leiv. So you have two examples over here of tzedakah and Karbanos, where the Torah, when I say Torah, by the way, by Karbanos, it's quoting a passage from Divrei Hayamim, from Navi. So again, in both contexts, the Torah, we'll call it the Torah, uses lashon of nidiv leiv to tell you that by tzedakah, and so the obligation to give tzedakah, if you have intention to give tzedakah, that creates a binding obligation. If you have intention to go ahead and bring a karban, that creates a binding obligation, even though you never verbally articulated your intention. So there are two examples. In general, whenever we have two examples of a rule, what is that called? Shnei ksuvin abayin ke'echad. Generally, if the Torah wants to create a principle, what does it do? States it once. If it states the principle twice, what that generally means is the principle applies in these two cases and is not to be applied as a rule in other cases. Mishum dahavi shnei ksuvin abayin ke'echad. V'chol shnei ksuvin abayin ke'echad ein malamdin. You can't learn out to other cases. Sahani chalmandar ein malamdin. So that's fine if you subscribe to that principle. Elamandar malamdin ma'ikal mimar. But I will say that's the machlokes itself. So according to the opinion that says Shnei ksuvin abayin ke'echad malamdin, why not create a rule and say, just like it says Nediv Leiv by Tzedakah, by Trumas HaMishkan, and it says Nediv Leiv by Karbanos, let's create a rule. What's the rule? That anytime you have intentionality, bless you, even if there's not articulation, halacha l'maisa, that should create a binding obligation, to which the Gemara says, Mishum, Michael Neymar, Havu chulin v'kachim, v'chulin v'kachim lo gamrina. No, there's a big reason. It could very well be that this idea that intentionality without articulation works to create a binding obligation as dafka by consecrated items. Because look at the two examples. It's Trumas HaMishkan, donation to the Mishkan, and Karbanos. So maybe this concept of intentionality without articulation works dafka by consecrated items, but cannot necessarily be applied to a chulin situation like Shevuos and Nidarim, or other Shevuos and Nidarim. So what comes out over here is the following. So halacha l'maisa, it turns out that we learned three very important components for a Shevuah. What are the three? Number one, intentionality. You have to have in your mind a clear vision of what it is that you are going to be swearing about. Number two, a matching articulation of your intention. Well, I'll call it, I really escaped. Number two is articulation, right? And number three, there must be a match between your intention and your articulation. Now again, what we see from the Gemara is the match doesn't necessarily have to be exact, but it has to be close enough that the articulation captures the essence of the intention. There are two exceptions to this, namely again, a vow to tzedakah, Trumas HaMishkan, and Karbanos, where in those cases, even intention without articulation will create a binding obligation. Just so you see that there's a tremendous life lesson in this that the articulation has to match the intention, or I should say, the articulation, which means what? A lot of times in life, we have like this disconnect between what we think or what we want and what we do. So life is all about creating this symmetry between the beliefs that we espouse and that we think about and how we actually live our lives. So this notion of it's not enough just to have the right intentions, but those intentions must find actual expression in the way that we live and the people that we are. You know, sometimes the greatest test for this is it's easy to espouse what your hashkafas and what your beliefs are. The best way to know that are you really a person who lives that is if somebody were to watch like a video of your day. Right? So to watch the video, and I mean like you know the what do they call it? Like the editor's cut. You know, no outtakes or anything like that. Right? The full unfiltered vision of my day. Would they be able to see what I believe, what I stand for from the way that I live? Not from what I say, because anyone could say anything. But the shaila is, do my intentions ultimately find expression in the way that I actually live my life? Or is there a disconnect between the beliefs I espouse and the actions I engage in? So a tremendous Musar hassle from Shevuos. It's not just enough to have the intention, but the intention must actually be articulated in the same exact way as well. Incredible. Mishnah Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Nishpa levatel samitzvah. So we'll say, actually, this is one of these Mishnahs. We've actually seen a number of these concepts already before. The Mishnah says as follows: Nishpa levatel samitzvah v'lo bitel. I swear I'm not going to put on tefillin. I swear, right? I swear to be mevatel on mitzvah, but I didn't do it. So it says, interesting. In other words, so I did not fulfill my shvuah. What's the halacha? Pater. I'm pater in this case, obviously, also because remember again, the shvuah itself is void, right? You can't swear not to fulfill a mitzvah. L'kayim v'lo kiyim pater. Similarly, if I made a shvuah to uphold the mitzvah, to perform a mitzvah, and I did not do it, I'm also pater. Why? So I'll say, so again, essentially what the Mishnah is saying is any shvuahs you make regarding mitzvahs essentially are null and void. Now the Gemara says interesting. Shaya b'din shechayiv. Now I would have thought that actually a shvuah about a mitzvah should actually work. Why? It's actually quite interesting. So the Gemara says, Shaya b'din shechayiv kidi Rabbi Yehuda. I would have thought because it's Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. What does Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira say? I'm Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. Ma'im harashos sheno mushpala mehar Sinai hariyu chayiv alav. They both say, if you could take a shvuah regarding a rashos. What's a rashos? A non-mitzvah act, just a mundane act. If I could swear regarding a loaf of bread, right, or any other mundane thing, for which I have absolutely no pre-existing obligation from Har Sinai, the Gemara says, by the way, what a beautiful zechus to see the words Har Sinai on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, right? Absolutely beautiful. What a beautiful remez. So the Gemara says, yet you're chayiv on that mitzvah. Shumushba alav mehar Sinai eino din shechayiv Allah. So I'll say, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira brings down an interesting kalachomer. He says, if shvuah creates a binding obligation for even the most mundane things for which you have no pre-existing obligation, then it would stand to reason that you should definitely be able to take a shvuah regarding things for which you are already obligated to do, right? And shvuah would just impose another layer of obligation. That's what I would have thought. Amrulo, they said to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, and therefore again, because Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, you should be able to take a shvuah even regarding a mitzvah. Amrulo, no, lo. Im amart b'shvuas harashos shekein asa ba lav kein tomar b'shvuas mitzvah shelo asa ba lav kein shem nishpa lavata v'lo bitel pater. They will say, remember again, they say back to the Rabbanan Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, your analogy doesn't work. I'll tell you why. Because Shevuos Bitui 101 is that what? A Shevuos Bitui has to be able to be phrased in both the positive and the negative. Right? I swear I will eat the loaf of bread. I swear I won't eat the loaf of bread. And if we're talking about swearing regarding a mitzvah, although you can phrase that in the positive, you cannot phrase that in the negative. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. To which the Gemara says, fine. That's the conversation we do in Meseira and the Rabbanan. Says the Gemara, Tanabanan, one would have thought that if you swear to be mavatal a mitzvah, right? Again, I swear I'm not going to put on tefillin. I swear I'm not going to keep Shabbos. You might have thought that ultimately, again, if I swear, now both say, now what's the good news? The good news is, I didn't uphold my shvuah. That's the good news, right? I swore I wasn't going to put on tefillin on Wednesday, and Baruch Hashem, I put on tefillin on Wednesday. So you might have thought, but you're going to be chayiv. Yachol yeh chayiv. I should be chayiv for not keeping my shvuah. Tamalomar lahara o lehetiv. The pasuk says, also remember again, we spent almost all of yesterday on this phrase. How does the Torah phrase shvuas bitui? Lahara o lehetiv, to do something bad or to do something good. Mahatavarashus, afhararashus. So I will say, so just like again, the good that we're referring to over here in the pasuk, ultimately again is a rishus, is something optional. So too, the hara, the negative, also has to be something optional. In other words, it has to be a discretionary act. And because a mitzvah is not a discretionary act, therefore it can't fall under the category ultimately of Shevuos Bitui. So the Gemara says, Otzi nishpa levatel mitzvah v'lo bital shu pater. This comes to exclude a case where I swear not to do a mitzvah, and ultimately, again, I did not comply with the shvuah, that there is no liability. Now, again, I both say, why is, if I swear not to put on tefillin, right, and I end up putting on tefillin, why is there no liability? When we say no, why is there no liability? Because there's no shvuah. Because there's no shvuah, right? So the Gemara is suggesting, why is there no shvuah? Because la ra o lehetiv refer to discretionary activities. And because putting on tefillin is not a discretionary activity, therefore, you can't make a shvuas bitui around it. Incredible. So the Gemara says as follows, conversely, what if I made a shvuah? I swear I'm going to put on tefillin today. And I didn't. Chas v'shalom, and I didn't. You might have thought that there should be liability, therefore, for non-compliance with my shvuah. Just the reverse. Lahara o lehetiv. The pasuk Shevuos Bitui says, what's the Shevuos Bitui? You swear to do something bad or to do something good. Ma hara arishos. Just like the negative act we're talking about over here, something discretionary. Af hatava rishos. So too the good act is also discretionary. Otzi nishpa lekayim es mitzvah v'lo ki'im shu pater. This comes to exclude ultimately again swearing to perform a mitzvah, which is not discretionary. Which is not discretionary. Because not discretionary, therefore any shvuah you make regarding it, one is going to go ahead and be pater. Incredible. Yachol, so we'll say, so again, so same theme. Now, obviously, what the Gemara is saying over here is we're rejecting the view of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. By the way, just keep Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira kind of in your back pocket a little bit, because this is very interesting, that although the Rabbanan, clearly the Gemara is going with the idea that pretty much any Shevuos Bitui regarding a mitzvah is not going to work. Now, again, I will say, remember, what you can do is, you could always go ahead. Now, what's the mechanism? If you want to create a mechanism to ultimately, again, create even an additional layer of obligation to do a mitzvah, what can you do? What can you do? What can you, somebody said it? Yeah. A neder. You can make a, right, remember again, nachshag, all comes back to nachshag, right? So remember again, one thing you can remember from Shevuos, right? So remember again, we'll talk about this. There is a way, if a person wants a mechanism to be mezares, to kind of like push mitzvah performance, you could utilize a neder on that. You can, but you can't do shvuah. You can't do shvuah. And again, essentially, because it all comes down to is, since again, shvuah is on the gavra, And since the Gavra is already under oath regarding mitzvos from Har Sinai, imposing another layer of oath obligation, it doesn't work. And by the way, that's even to perform a mitzvah. Obviously, not to perform a mitzvah, but even to perform a mitzvah doesn't work. And it all comes down to because lahara lahitiv, the Gemara's darshaning, is discretionary activity. Okay, so the Gemara goes on in this theme. The Gemara says, Yachol nishpa lahara li atzmo v'lahara yachol yei pater. So I'll say, what if I swear to do something negative to myself? I don't know. I swear to slap myself in the face, right? I don't know, something crazy, right? Or I swear not to eat. I swear not to drink, right? I swear to do something negative to myself, and let's say I didn't do it. You might have thought that you're pater. Talmud lomar lahara lahitiv. The Gemara says no. Lahara lahitiv. Ma tavarishos afararishos. Avi nishpa lahara liatzmo v'lo hara sharishos biyado. Both say if I want to do something negative to myself, that's a discretionary act. I can do that. Now we're assuming over here we're not talking about something that puts oneself in mortal danger, but assuming that halacha l'maisa, again, this is something that halacha l'maisa, again, I'm allowed to do to myself. So again, I have the right to do it. So if I say, I swear I'm going to slap myself in the face, again, I'm just using an exaggerated case just to make the point, right? And I don't do so, I'm chayiv. I'm in violation of my own Shevuos bitoy. Why? Because slapping myself in the face ultimately is a discretionary act. What if I swear I'm going to slap Reuven in the face, right? Or I swear I'm going to go ahead and do something negative or harmful to Reuven, and I don't do it. That's the good news, right? Good news is I didn't do it. I'm sorry. Ma tavarishos afhararishos otzi nishpa lahara liacher v'lahara she'ein harishus biyado. So I'll say, obviously, again, I have no right to do something negative to someone else. Again, I have a right to slap myself in the face. I don't have any right to slap anyone else in the face. So the Gemara says, minayin l'rabos hatavas acherim. Now I'll say, how do I know that halacha l'maisa, again, what if I swear to do something good for someone else? I swear to give Reuven the loaf of bread. Right? I swear to give Reuven $10, assuming that Reuven is not tzedakah. Right? I swear to go ahead and give him a gift. Right? So how do I know that ultimately that creates a binding obligation? So the Gemara says, Talmud lomar ola hativ. Good, fine. Therefore, the pasuk says, or to do something good. So the ezu hi hara'as achirim. So we'll say, what's an example of doing something negative to someone? Ake esploni ve'eftzes mocho. I'm going to hit Reuven in the head and split open his skull. Yeah, that qualifies. That definitely that hits the mark, right? Go big or go home. So the mice again. So that's an example. I'm just giving an example that literally again physically harming someone. Umimai. So we'll say. So now remember, all of these cases are predicated on the concept that lahara or lahetiv is talking about non-mitzvah discretionary activity. Right, because that's really remember. Because if we circle back, the real thing we're really focusing on over here is that Shevuos regarding mitzvahs really don't work. Right, there's no such concept. Why? Because the Ra'ul Hativ is all discretionary activity. So we'll say. So now the Gemara says, how do you know that? Right. In other words, really at the end of the day, I understand you're making the drasha, but the Gemara says, Umimai dekrai b'dvar harashus ksivi, Dilma b'dvar mitzvah ksivi. I don't know. All it says is Ra'ul Hativ. How do you know that it's talking about discretionary activity? Maybe it's talking about a mitzvah. Whereas lo, I'll tell you why. Lo s'chadayt v'deba'inan hatava dumya dahara v'hara dumya da'atava. Because remember again, the tov has to be comparable to the ra, and the ra has to be comparable to the tov. So the Gemara says, da'akish hara lahatava mahatava eino bebitul mitzvah. The same way that the good obviously does not refer to the negation of a mitzvah, so to the ra can't refer to the negation of a mitzvah. Hara, so the Gemara says, therefore, again, so obviously we can't be talking about mitzvahs over here. Hara gufa hatavahi, because in that case, ultimately, again, the hara is, in and of itself is the hatava. The akish hatava la, and we'll compare the hatava to the hara. Mahara ena b'kiyam mitzvah, just like the hara ultimately, again, is not referring to the fulfillment of a mitzvah. Haf hatava ena b'kiyam mitzvah. Because again, if that's the case, hatava gufa harahi. Okay, so if that's the Gemara understands over here. So therefore, halacha l'maisa, we have to exclude mitzvahs from this and instead make this a discretionary act. Ihachi bidvar reshus nami lo mishkachas lo. Suppose say if that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, again, we could run into a situation, even if you compare this, even if you want to make this about a dvar rishus. In other words, the comparison between the hatava and the hara, to which the Gemara says, Ella, mid the istrich o l'rabos hatavas achirim, shmamina b'dvar rishus ksivi. So the Gemara says very interesting. For the fact that we need the word o to go ahead and include a case of doing good for others, that would seem to indicate that we're talking only about discretionary activity. Bless you. Because if we would just be talking about a dvar mitzvah, so the Gemara says, hashta, haras acherim israbi, hatavas acherim iboy. If we're including ultimately, again, a case of haras acherim, does there need to be any discussion about hatavas acherim? Everything Gemara says, fine. So let's stop there for just. So bottom line, here's the takeaway. The takeaway is that all of this, remember again, let's just go through quick progression before we get to the next piece. The Gemara says, remember, all of this comes down to fundamental machlokes Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says you can make a Shevuos bitui regarding mitzvahs based on his kal v'chomer as espoused in the Mishnah. Rabbanan say you cannot. What is the basis of the Rabbanan's drasha? Or what's the basis of their position? A drasha of lahara lehetiv. That's it. Lahara lehetiv, only referring to discretionary activity. Bottom line, okay? The Gemara just gave the whole drush of lahara lehetiv. The Gemara just says, v'hai o mi bai le lechalik. So ultimately, v'hai o mi bai le lechalik. Ultimately, again, we're using that o to make that distinction. Lechalik lo tzarech kra. I don't need the o for chiluk. Why not? Gemara says, I'm sorry, lechalik lo tzarech kra. So Gemara says, hani Rabbi Yochanan. That makes it called Rabbi Yochanan. El Rabbi Oshia ma'ikal meimar. But according to Rabbi Oshia, what is there to say? Now, what are we talking about over here? Tisanya, ish asher yikalel es aviv ve'es imo. A man will curse if a man will curse his mother and his father, or his father and his mother. Einli ela aviv v'imo. I don't know that there's liability if he curses both parents. The Gemara says, "Eni ala aviv imo, aviv v'lo imo, imo v'lo aviv minayin." How do I know that even if he curses one parent and doesn't curse the other, there's liability? Tamalamar aviv v'imo kilel, aviv kilel imo kilel de Rabbi Yoshia. So Rabbi Yoshia says ultimately again, we can break apart the pasuk. Rabbi Yonasan says, "Mashma shneim ke'echad." Ultimately, again, on one hand, the pasuk seems to indicate that there's liability for cursing both of them at once, and also liability for cursing one of them, or cursing them independently. Ad amud beis, ad sheyifrot lecha kasav yachtov, until the pasuk ultimately again tells you explicitly. In other words, what Rabbi Yonasan is saying is like this. Even though it mentions father and mother together, the understanding is that you're liable for cursing them together or independently. The only time we would have a havamina that you're only chayiv for cursing them together is if the pasuk would be explicit about that. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yoshia, you can still set up the previous conversation with Rabbi Yoshia. So I say again, so that machlokes goes back to the previous machlokes as to whether or not you need ol lechalik. So afilu tim Rabbi Yoshia, v'savla Rabbi Akiva. So it's possible that it reflects the view of Rabbi Yoshia, and he holds like Rabbi Akiva, who darshans ribi u'miut, yesterday's daf, like his Rabbi Nachum ish Gamzu. So ultimately, again, if you assume that the pasuk lahara lehetiv is talking about a dvar rishus, then ultimately, again, the o lahara o lehetiv, the o is coming to exclude a dvar mitzvah. But ultimately, again, if you assume that lahara lehetiv is talking about even a dvar mitzvah, then what? Then the Gemara says mimai kamemai. Then ultimately, what is being excluded? Okay, we'll say bottom line again. Takeaway: we just did a tremendous amount of exposition on that drasha of lahara lehetiv, but the bottom line takeaway is lahara lehetiv teaches me only discretionary activity governed by Shevuos bitui. As such, Shevuah regarding a mitzvah, Shevuos bitui regarding a mitzvah, is not going to be a binding Shevuah. Now, with the Gemara ends off, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, my marashos. I will say, and I remember again. So, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, what was his logic? He made a kal v'chomer. What was his kal v'chomer? If ultimately, again, if a Shevuah works for a discretionary item that you do not have any previous obligation regarding, and the Shevuah works to create the binding obligation, then alachas kama v'kama, Shevuah will create a binding obligation upon something that you are already bound to, i.e., a mitzvah. a mitzvah. Now, ultimately, again, what do the Rabbanan say back to Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira? The Rabbanan say it doesn't work. Why? Because remember, when the Torah speaks about Shevuos Bitoy, what does the Torah say? Lahara lahetiv, which means what? Which means what? A Shevuos Bitoy has to be able to be phrased both in the I will and won't do phraseology, positive and negative. And by a dvar reshus, by a discretionary action, you can do that. By a mitzvah, you cannot. You cannot. So it says the Gemara of Rabbanon, Shapir ka'amri leil Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. The Rabbanon are saying good. They're saying good back to Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira. So what does Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira say? Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira amar lacha, atu atavas achirim, lav afagav delese bechlal haras achirim. Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira says that's not true. I'll tell you why it's not true. I will say, imagine the following case. Imagine the following case, right? I say, I'm going to go ahead and give Reuven a loaf of bread. Imagine if I say in the negative, I'm going to take from Reuven a loaf of bread. That doesn't work. So you can't necessarily phrase every single discretionary act, even in the negative as well. So again, again, that's not true. In other words, there are plenty of cases where you can't frame it. You can't frame the discretionary act in the negative and be allowed to do that. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Rachmana, yet nevertheless the Torah says, so Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseira is pointing out is, there are even cases of discretionary acts where you can't frame it in the negative, yet the Shevuos Bitoy still works. Hakanami b'kiyo mitzvah. Afagav delese bebitul mitzvah Rabbi Rachmana. So too again, Rabbi Yehuda wants to say, so too in the case of a mitzvah, even though you can't frame the mitzvah in the negative, the Shevuos Bitoy should still work. To which the Gemara said, V'Rabbanan, it's not true. Hasam isei below etiv. It's not true. The Rabbanan will say like this. Every discretionary act, you can't frame in the negative. Now again, while it's true, I can't say, Shvuah, I'm going to give you a loaf of bread, and Shvuah, I'm going to take from you a loaf of bread, right? That won't work. But I can do what? I could say, Shvuah, I will give you a loaf of bread, and what? And what? What's the negative? Shvuah, I won't give you a loaf of bread. That works. In other words, so not doing good. Every single Shevuos Bitoy, the Rabbanan say, can be phrased, the positive action can be phrased in a permissible negative way. That is not true by mitzvos. So whereas technically I could say Shvuah, I will put on tefillin, I can't say Shvuah, I won't put on tefillin. That does not work. And because it does not work, therefore halacha l'maisa, the Shvuah is. So therefore again, a number of concrete pieces of halacha l'maisa. So first of all, we pass like the Rabbanon. Ultimately, again, that Shevuos Bitoy cannot be made regarding mitzvos. That's halacha l'maisa number one. Now again, why is that? Really based on the drasha of the Rabbanon, that Shevuos Bitoy is all anchored in one simple phrase, lahara o lehetiv, which represents what? Discretionary activity. Discretionary activity, and again, once again, reinforce, so therefore, that's how we paskin. Shevuos Bitoy only regarding discretionary activity, based on drasha of lahara lehetiv. And again, we once again reinforce that in order for a Shevuos Bitoy to be valid, what has to happen? You have to be able to phrase it both in the positive and the negative. Beautiful. Mishnah. Shevuos shelo ochal kikar zu, Shevuos shelo achlana, Shevuos shelo achalna, va'achla, eino chayiv ela achas. So Rabbi said this is very important. We've actually seen this before. So Rabbi said, here's what I do. I take 3 Shevuos regarding the same loaf of bread. Right? So I say, Shevuos shelo ochal kikar zu. I swear I'm not going to eat this loaf of bread. That's number 1. Number 2, Shevuos shelo achlana. I swear I'm not going to eat it. Number 3, Shevuos shelo achalna. I swear I'm not going to eat it. 3 Shevuos, and I eat it. And I eat it. What's the halacha? Eino chayiv ela achas. Rabbi said, I'm only chayiv once. What's the logic behind that? Essentially, once you aser that loaf through a shvuah, it's aser. It's aser. Adding on additional layers of prohibition on the shvuah is really halachically inconsequential. So although there's 3 shvuahs, again, I will say once something is, and by the way, this is the mitzvah logic. Same way, once I'm under oath to do a mitzvah, adding on another layer of shvuah is halachically inconsequential. So once I aser the loaf and I say shvuah, I'm not going to eat the loaf, subsequent shvuahs have no room to devolve upon that object. Therefore, there's only one layer of liability. So the Gemara says, "Zoi Shevuos Bitoy shechayav asdona makas bas shegagasa ola v'yored." And I will say this shvuah that we're talking about, Shevuos Bitoy. Again, if you intentionally violate a Shevuos Bitoy, chiyav malchus. Unintentionally violate a Shevuos Bitoy, and I will say again, remember what's the definition of unintentional violation? Helam shvuah. I forgot about the Shvuah and I committed the act, ultimately there is carbonic liability, carbon ola v'yored. Shevuos shav. What about a false oath? And again, we're talking, we know what's the definition of Shevuos shav. Nishba l'shanos es hayadua. There's a fact that is known to at least 3 people, and I swear to change that fact. Everyone knows that a man is a man, a woman is a woman. I swear that the man is a woman, the woman is a man. That's a Shevuos shav. Ultimately, again, what's the halacha? Chayovin al zadona makus v'ashigagasa pater. For that case, intentional violation is malkus. Accidental violation is pater. Says the Gemara, Lama li lemisna shvur shelo ochal, shvur shelo ochal no. So I'll say, so here's what's interesting. So if you notice, what was the point the Mishnah was making? Right, the Mishnah is making a point. What's the point? That if you make repetitive shvuos about the same object, what's the halacha? You're only chayiv once. But if you notice, what did the Mishnah do? The Mishnah varied the lashon in Shevuos 1, 2, and 3, right? Shvuah number 1 is Shvuah shelo ochal kikar. I swear I won't eat this loaf. Shvuah number 2 is Shvuah shelo ochalna, right? And then Shvuah number 3 is Shvuah shelo ochalna. So 2 and 3 are the same. Right? Point is, why are you varying the lashon? Why don't you say Shvuah shelo ochal kikar zu, Shvuah shelo ochal kikar zu, Shvuah shelo ochal kikar zu? Why are you varying the lashon? So this is very interesting. Hakamash malan taima da'amar shelo ochal v'hada amar shelo ochalena d'lo machai v'lechada. The order here over here is very specific. The reason why you're only chayiv once is because first you said shvo shelo ochal, and then you said shvo shelo ochlena, right? However, aval amar shelo ochlena, v'hadar amar shelo ochal, mechayiv tarti kiderava. Wow. Now let's say if you were to reverse the order, if you were to say shvo shelo ochalna, which means I will not eat it, and then you were to say shvo shelo ochal kikar zu, and you ate the loaf, you would be liable twice, like Rava. Why? Dama Rava, shvur shelo ochal kikar zu, kevan sha'achal mimena kezayis chayiv. You're supposed to listen to this. Rava says, when you make a neder, I swear I will not eat this loaf. How much of the loaf do you have to eat in order to go ahead and be liable? A kezayis. On the other hand, shelo ochalna, Eino chayiv achi yochal eskula. But if you say shvur shelo ochalna, I will not eat it, then what? You're only chayiv if you eat the entire loaf. So watch this. This is very interesting. So if a person were to say shvur shelo ochal kikar, like the Mishnah's case, shvur shelo ochal kikar zu, shvur shelo ochalna. So essentially, again, in my first neder, what did I prohibit? A kizayis. Second neder, right? Shelo ochal kikar zu is a kizayis. Then in the second neder, shvur. The second shvur, what do I say? Shvur shelo ochalna, which is what? Which is the whole loaf. In essence, I haven't added anything, right? Why? Because obviously, once I'm already chayiv in a kizayis, of course I'm chayiv in the whole loaf. So nothing's been added by the second shvuah. Because nothing's been added, therefore halacha l'maisa, there's no additional layer of liability. But watch this. If I were to say first shvuah shelo ochalna, what's the shear? What's the shear for liability? Whole loaf. I'm only liable for eating the whole loaf. If I then make a second shvuah shelo ochal kikar zu, now I have added liability. Why? Because before, with the first shvuah, I was only chayiv if I eat the whole loaf. Now with the second shvuah, I'm chayiv what? Even if I just eat a kizayis. So what do you see from here? When do we say that multiple shvuos do not create additional liability? When the second shvuah or third shvuah don't add a new dimension of isser. But if the second or third shavuos add a new dimension of isser, then they in fact devolve upon the object, right? Incredible, right? Or devolve upon the person, devolve upon the individual, right? And that's why which makes sense. In other words, a second shvuah doesn't do anything if it doesn't add anything. But if the second shvuah in fact does add something, then halacha says liability. So if the first shvuah was shvur shelo ochalna, I'm not going to eat the whole loaf, and liability is on the whole loaf, so the whole loaf is already aser. Sorry, different. Shvur shelo ochal kikar zu, so I'm already chayv in a kizayis. If I make a secondary shvuah that makes me chayv on the whole loaf, I haven't added anything. But if the first shvuah was I won't eat the whole loaf, there's only liability if I eat the loaf, and the second shvuah adds liability for eating a kizayis, and then I eat the loaf, I'm chayv twice. Because the second shvuah, in fact, added a level of isra onto the first. All right, so we'll stop over for today. But good run today. Shkayach, everyone. All right. Skills of Rosh Chodesh. New beginnings. To staying on track with Daf Yomi. Shkayach, everyone. A good Chodesh.
How do we know Shiloh for Kikar Zoo? It's not the whole thing. It's not make Kikar Zoo.
But that's how it's interpreted. Kikar Zu is make Kikar Zu. That's how it's interpreted in halach. That's how it's understood.